Hey, what's up? Time for another Classic Fight Club with Jimmy Smith. This time it's Frank Shamrock versus Enson Inoue. This was one of those fights that you had to watch when I started. Like, one of the reasons I started doing this project is the canon of fights, the must-watch fights that I start out with have kind of faded out of MMA history. Meaning, if you're a recent fan and you want to get someone excited about MMA, you show them Rory McDonald versus Robbie Lawler 2, right? If you're an older fan, you might show them Forrest Stephan Bonner. That was the big highlight for a lot of years. The ones that I came up with are mostly forgotten now. Fans don't, oh my God, of course I've seen Enson Inoue versus Frank Shamrock. Of course I've seen Pele versus Macaco, which is another one I'll go over in a minute. Those are ones you had to know when I started out. So I'm trying to kind of refresh that idea and show you guys some fights you may not have seen, but that were must watch back in the day. Frank Shamrock versus Tito Ortiz was considered the greatest fight in mixed martial arts history for a long time, for quite a few years, until other fights just eclipsed it. So anyway, we tend to move past and forget those things. I think a modern boxing fan, still watches Hagler Hearns. They still watch the classics, old Tyson fights and Ali fights and stuff. I don't think MMA fans do that as much as they should, especially fights that are outside of the UFC or Pride. So another thing, I'm going to go over some stuff that people ask me about in the comment section. Number one, somebody asked me about doing Rickson Gracie's fights. The problem I have with Rickson Gracie's career, period, is he just didn't fight very many interesting, historically significant fights. The only two guys he fought that had actual careers were Yuki Nakai and Masakatsu Funaki. If you watch the tournament in which Rickson beat Yuki Nakai, the round before, Yuki Nakai got the piss beaten out of him. And he was really beaten up, and he is half Rickson's size, and Rickson just passes guard and beats him. Rear naked choke, I believe. And then the Funaki fight, Masakatsu Funaki had never fought full rules MMA. He'd only fought in Pancrase. And Rickson takes him down, passes guard, and once again wins via rear naked choke. It's almost like breaking down early Royce Gracie fights. The guys didn't know enough to compete, so they're not particularly compelling fights. They aren't the biggest names who were around even at the time. Even for the era in which Rickson competed, he fought pretty bad talent. Bud Smith, guys like that. I mean, these guys were not fighters. So Funaki and Nakai are the only real names. And for the reasons I just mentioned, they aren't particularly interesting fights. At Pride 4, for example, he fought Nobuhiko Takada, who was a pro wrestler he had already beaten twice. Who fought on that card? Mark Kerr, Sakuraba was on that card, Alan Goes. Marco Huas fought that night, Igor Vovchanchin, Akira Shoji. If he'd beaten any of those guys, I'd have something to talk about. He didn't. He fought a pro wrestler he'd already beaten once. So that's the problem with breaking down Rickson's fights. They're just not, there's not a lot of meat on the bone. They're not that significant in terms of MMA history, and there's not a lot of back and forth. They're just not very competitive. Because of, once again, I believe the choice of opposition. He fought some big money fights, most notably against Takada twice, but the talent that would have really elevated his legacy, he didn't fight those guys. So probably won't do any Rickson fights. If I do, I might do a montage of them or something like that. There's no one fight that's particularly compelling. So another one that I have to talk about is under the Anderson Silva fight. Let me see here. I'm scrolling through it. It was, I assume it's his real name. Where are you? It is, his name is Chris Pacheco, who wrote on my comment section, "You're going to say Sakurai," Chris Pacheco's his name, "you're going to say Sakurai is more of a talented fighter than Lima? Of course not. Jimmy, you're real dumb sometimes." Then, when people go in and go, MVP lost to Lima, obviously, and he calls the other guy casual. So someone goes in and says he lost to Lima. The question is, who faced tougher talent, Silva or MVP? Anyone who isn't a shill like Jimmy or casual like you can tell MVP faced tougher guys. Let me explain very quickly, Chris. The issue is, Hayato Sakurai, at the time Anderson Silva beat him, was the #1 fighter in the world. And MVP hasn't come anywhere near the #1 fighter in the world. The one fighter he did, who was maybe top 5 in Douglas Lima, he got knocked out. If he had beaten Douglas Lima with a no-look punch, then you'd have something to argue about. People like Chris have this idea that anyone before a certain era, they all suck. It's not about whether or not you put them in a time machine and they can compete with a modern fighter. Most fighters of that era, late 90s, early 2000s, can't compete with modern mixed martial artists. The sport has evolved too much. Now, would you take away the legacy of Babe Ruth by saying he doesn't hit 60 home runs in the modern major leagues? No. You don't hit what he hit on a diet of sausages, prostitutes, and beer. It doesn't work that way anymore. But that's not what he was facing. He was facing pitchers in the 1920s, and he's one of the best hitters of all time. It's not about taking them and saying, how would this fighter do against this fighter if you put them in a time machine? Frank Shamrock, the fighter we're about to see, was the top light heavyweight in the world at the time. Not in this fight, a little bit later. And is he competitive against a modern light heavyweight? No, he's not big enough at all. He's not skilled enough. It's a different world. The idea is not, is this fighter better than this fighter if you put them in the same room right now in their prime? It's about how they did against the talent that was available to them. And the argument is, MVP has not faced the number one welterweight in the world. And he hasn't been victorious. If you can even consider Lima the number one welterweight in the world, he was not victorious against that guy. And that's it. When it comes to the rankings nowadays, today, MVP has not faced the level of talent that Anderson Silva did, which is he beat the number one guy in the world, and then he beat Carlos Newton, who right before that was the number one guy in the world. MVP can't claim that. So Chris can yell and scream all he wants, but it's everything wrong about the way to see historical fights, which is if you put them in a time machine, how would they do? You have to judge them against the talent that was available for them to fight against. And the issue about evaluating MMA in that context is the sport itself has evolved dramatically over the last 20 years. Almost no fighters of that era are competitive now, simply because the rate at which it has improved. It's almost like, once again, looking at baseball in the 1920s. That's how similar it is. Most of those hitters don't do well now. Most of those pitchers don't do well now. It's just a different world. So that idea that this guy beats this guy, put him in a time machine, that's stupid. Stupid. They're from different eras. As far as rankings go, MVP hasn't fought the number one guy. Anderson Silva did and beat him. So, there you go, Chris. Anyway, now let's move on to Frank Shamrock versus Enson Inoue. This is at Japan Valley Tudo 1997. So, I'm gonna do something very rare here. I'm gonna spare you the first round because it's pretty bad. Basically, Frank takes him down, stays in his guard the whole time. This is at light heavyweight. Once again in Japan, there's Enson Inoue. I'm going to take away my little square here because you guys can hear me anyway. And there is Frank Juarez Shamrock. So both these guys are at light heavyweight. There's a little history lesson here. Enson Inoue was supposed to face Tito Ortiz in the finals of the UFC, but he hurt his hand. Arm barring. Royce Alger was his name. Anyway, he hurt his hand. So Tito Ortiz, he wasn't supposed to face Tito Ortiz. He was supposed to face Guy Metzger. Guy Metzger beat Christoph Ledinger and then got into the finals, and Tito Ortiz was an alternate. So Enson Inoue hurts his hand against Royce Alger, and then we get Tito Ortiz versus Guy Metzger, and the rest is history. But that was supposed to be Enson Inoue versus Guy Metzger. So Frank Shamrock has messed up and ends up fully mounted by Enson Inoue, who I believe was a brown belt at this point. But the tactical choice here is a modern fighter wouldn't do that much. Frank Shamrock is holding on. It keeps his head close to your chest so he can't sit up and land great ground and pound, but it burns your arms out. So that's not an escape technique to hold on like this. You got to hold on briefly, and then you got to move. You got to be mobile. And right now, Frank Shamrock holding on to Enson Inoue. Whenever anybody does this, they're not trying to escape. They're waiting for you to make an escape so they can explode. So Enson Inoue being very cautious with this, hips pretty low, but notice he's not walking his mount up under the armpits. He's staying really low with the mount, which in this position, when a guy puts his arms up and gives you that space, generally I like to take it, but some people like a lower mount. Sometimes to make ground and pound a little bit easier. It's a tactical choice. But Both these guys pretty much in their physical primes. This is one of the best fights I think either guy had. Later on, Frank Shamrock would take on Tito Ortiz, which would be, to a lot of people, the greatest MMA fight of all time for several years, as I explained. But Enson at this point, actually his entire career, was known for being almost, I hate saying this, like suicidally reckless. If you watch his fight with Igor Vovchanchyn in Pride, Igor was one of the hardest hitters in Pride, one of the hardest hitters pound for pound in MMA history. It was at heavyweight, Enson Inoue, not a heavyweight, and he walks forward and basically slings bombs with Igor Vovchanchyn until Igor gets on top of him. Igor beats him through the canvas. The doctor stops the fight, I believe in between rounds, and Enson Inoue literally really protests. And I don't mean, it didn't look like a show. Like, he was really upset it was stopped. He went straight to the hospital. It was a scary beatdown. But that's the kind of fighter Enson Inoue was he would get in a war and just make it a battle of attrition, convinced that he could hit harder and take more than his opponent. He really tried to go out on his shield every single time. Frank really holding on underneath in mount, holding on for dear life. And an interesting thing, if you watch this fight with the sound, if you find a copy of it and want to listen to it with sound, they're so silent in the arena until they start chanting Inoue, which they do, that the corners are actually almost talking to one another because they're talking to their guys, but it's so quiet that they can hear each other. Now, Enson Inoue is Hawaiian, so he speaks English. His corner speaks English. His brother Egan is in his corner. Egan Inoue, MMA fighter in his own right. But it was weird because they're giving their fighters advice and they can hear each other and they kind of start, there's a little bit of gamesmanship there because it's so quiet. That happened a lot in Japan. But Egan holding on to the mount, not going crazy with it. Not a bad choice in that it takes a lot of energy out of your opponent. Just stay on top, wear him down. Now, Frank Shamrock at this point in his career is known for crazy cardio. The guy could just go and go and go and go and go. He was coming off I don't know if it was right before this fight, but he had lost to John Lober in his first full mixed martial arts fight at Super Brawl in Hawaii. Really long fight, half hour, I think. And after that, he really upped his MMA game. That was a fight he was really supposed to win. It was kind of a showcase for him, and he lost. It was a big upset at the time. And this is kind of his, he kind of rededicated himself to MMA, not just pancrase, which was open hand. And this is the result of that. But you see Enson just not able to create space with his forearm or get anything done in terms of like real serious ground and pound. But Frank not doing the hip escape, not pushing on the knees, not doing all the mount escape stuff you would suspect. Here's where he bridges and Enson Inoue not letting him go. Staying on top. Both these guys small for light heavyweight. And I've said that in other videos, and it's really true. At this era in mixed martial arts, fighters were just a lot lighter than they are now. These guys are not big middleweights even, and they were fighting in the light heavyweight division. What we would call light heavyweight. It was called middleweight at this point. And Enson finally sitting back to get space, and that's when you can really unload a better ground and pound, but it also gives your opponent a way out, and Frank takes it. And this is where Enson Inoue does what Enson Inoue does. Stepping forward, throwing reckless punches, and Frank Shamrock willing to get in there with him. First time I saw this, man, fell in love with MMA, man. I see Enson just a little bit bigger than Frank Shamrock. He's more confident with his punches. Frank needing a little bit of a break, getting in a clinch there. Bad move stepping that leg forward for Enson Inoue, letting Frank behind him. Never want to do that. Now it's Frank's turn to put a little physical pressure on, and Enson Inoue may have punched himself out just a little bit. Needs a little bit of a break. Because all Enson wants is enough space to get into another brawl. That's where he's at his best. That's where he really loves to fight. Frank at this point with the alliance. Maurice Smith is in his corner. I think Tsuyoshi Kosaka is there too. And as soon as Enson gets any space, he wants to throw big shots. Frank keeping his head in the middle, but you got to watch the clinch. Got to watch the tie plum in those positions. Nice knee. Then Frank gets his and bang, right to the jaw. This is where Frank turns it on. Boom. And that is it. Now, here's the controversial finish. For a lot of years, this was called a disqualification because that's Egan Inoue. That is Enson's brother on top of him to the right with the like green shirt on. He saw his brother go out and he rushes in to stop the fight. Now, the referee was right there about to call it a knockout anyway, but Egan rushing in, for a lot of years, this was called a disqualification. I think it's listed. That's Tsuyoshi Kosaka on the left right there. That's Maurice Smith hugging Frank Shamrock, but great finish. Knee right to the jaw. That was the end of it. But that was like a classic throwdown finish for so many years in MMA. Everybody, this fight was like legend. Like, oh, Frank Shamrock versus Enson Inoue. You got to see that fight. Both these guys are warriors, and just one shot, one knee to the jaw that ended it. But good stuff. And here it is, a replay of it. Frank got enough space. Look at this knee. Bam! That is it, face down. A referee waves it off right there. Frank throws one extra punch, and Egan Inoue runs in. Good stuff, man. Good sportsmanship, like both those fighters. That is today's history lesson. Egan Inoue, Frank Shamrock, Japan Valley Tudo, 1997. If you like it, you appreciate it, share it, give it a like, and I will do one later this week. Plan on doing 2 a week, see if they catch on. Later, guys. See you soon.